Welcome to Accessible Media, a podcast created by yours truly, Lizz Hodgson. I'm doing this as a part of a directed reading course with Barbara Evans as my supervisor. And I'm aiming to look at accessibility in media, but also how those with disabilities have been represented in media. This episode is to introduce you to the ideas and themes that I will be working through. Throughout the podcast, I plan to speak to a few different people who work within the areas of disability. This could be through their PhD, their theses, and essentially looking to further their research or their personal experiences in regards to disability and accessibility. So I should probably give you a little background on myself. I have always found disability to be a theme within my life, though I do not myself have a disability, nor does anyone directly in my family. However, very young, I always found myself befriending people with disabilities or being asked by a teacher to assist a student who might have a disability to help them out with getting on the bus or something of that nature. This kind of theme continued throughout my life in middle school when my best friend, who I found in grade 9, her brother had cerebral palsy, and I spent so much time with their family and being around such strong people who were advocates for people with disabilities really shaped who I was. This individual, Neil, he always had such a great interest in media, and he was somebody who always just was so interested in entertainment in so many different ways. And I did often find myself wondering when, he kind of obsessively watched certain videos over and over again and was a real big consumer of music. I often found myself wondering about how he felt that, everything that he consumed and everything that he watched, that there wasn't anybody actually reflected back at him who was similar to himself. He looked up to people, of course, who were maybe able-minded and able-bodied, but it was really interesting to observe Neil and sometimes wonder how he felt. I should probably ask him that question one day. Further to that, in university, I ended up getting a job essentially with a creative arts company that worked within the realm of theater and film and performance that served the disability population. And it was such a rewarding experience to create accessible media and accessible stage performance for individuals with disabilities. This came in the way of adapting different types of plays and different media in sound recording and movement and film and video to represent and also include people with disabilities to make this media, to be visible, to be seen, to have their voices heard, creating monologues about their experiences and performing them for people in professional theater. All of that sort of shaped how I view things, how I view representation in media, how I really feel that there should be so much more variety of people who we see. It shouldn't just be contained to Sue Thomas or Sue Thompson FBI, somebody who's deaf and sees things in the world as like her, quote unquote, sort of superpower. It should be also within just the mainstream. Every time we walk around in our daily lives, maybe as able-bodied people or people who don't necessarily identify as someone with a disability, we always come across people with different varying abilities. That's a normal part of life. And I don't feel that media represents that. I don't feel it represents it at all. You may go to the bank and have a teller who serve you who is a wheelchair user. That's a very non-common thing to see in media. It's just not done. There's been some endeavors in my life to change this narrative. I spent a lot of my time as a documentarian in my early years while studying at York in my undergrad, making films about people with disabilities. I made a film called Welcome to Holland about a very lovely family from Rochester who, again, too, are big advocates for individuals with disabilities. And I followed around and documented their son, Todd Quist, who had a rare genetic disorder. And it's an interesting timing that I'm putting this podcast together for this course because, unfortunately, we lost Todd this year. He came to epilepsy that was related to his genetic illness. And that was a big deal for me. You know, that was a huge part of my documentary introduction. You know, interviewing this family and really getting a view of their personal lives and how they felt about their situation and how much joy Todd brought in such a different way. You know, it was a non-typical way, and how they found life and their family change when they had Todd, and how beautiful it was when they were growing with him, essentially on his own schedule and at his own pace. That was a big introduction for me, and I continued to make some documentaries about people with disabilities. One was called The Nature of Creativity, following the creative arts company that I mentioned earlier, which I worked in throughout university. And that was following sort of the creative process with people with disabilities, but also interviewed an individual named Victor Pereira, who explained very much in detail that despite having an intellectual disability, that his experience within the school system is really something that bothers him, because there is a bigger need to, he feels, as somebody who has an intellectual disability going through the school system in high school, to, you know, really be challenged in an academic sense and not doing the same things over and over again and not being fed the same sort of curriculum. That was sort of the introduction for me to be presenting a platform, I should say, for individuals to speak about their experiences, either caring for or being a person with an intellectual or physical disability. And that's really started my life's work, I think. And it's been a thematic thing that I've been interested in, but I've also worked in positions, but also my art follows these themes. So it's fitting that this podcast comes about as I set out to create a documentary in my thesis for my Master's of Cinema Media Arts with York about epilepsy. And some of my research intersects with this podcast, but essentially representation in media and giving voice to people, or presenting a platform for voices to be given, to be heard, is really present right now in my life. I've also worked in some of in fiction with a gentleman named Russell Winkler, and written by a past York graduate, a film called Eligible, which was a Bravo Fact recipient. And I shot that, I believe, in 2014. And I was very set on casting somebody who had a disability, who wasn't just playing someone with a disability. I was very inspired by this from watching RJ Mitty on Breaking Bad. RJ is an individual with cerebral palsy, and he plays an individual with cerebral palsy on Breaking Bad. And he is a part of a great advocacy and movement for more representation and seeing people with, you know, disabilities of all different kinds in media and represented accordingly, I think. So that was a real big inspiration for me to make sure that who I was casting was playing who we wrote about. So Eligible, essentially, the background of that is an individual with a disability, physical disability, who uses a wheelchair, creates 2 dating profiles. One where he pretends essentially to be an able-bodied person and uses fake photos, essentially, of an able-bodied person to connect with somebody who he has a crush on online. And then he also has the exact same profile who he chats with the same people he has crushes on in his true form, with his, you know, picture of himself showing that he has is a wheelchair user. And it's the result of that and how he actually ends up being stood up by somebody because of his disability. And it's a very lonesome sort of situation, but one that Russell Winkler, the actor who took on the role, says is very common for him. And it was looking more at, you know, the dating world, digitally, the digital dating world, and what the reality for people with disabilities is out there. So essentially, this podcast will go through many different episodes, and I'll be reviewing things like articles that I read about representation in media, speaking about an institute that I found called the Rudder Family Institute, which performs amazing market research about representation. And I'll also be chronicling a couple of different places that and projects that I'm undertaking throughout this course, one of which being with CAMH and the Special Olympics group that I've made a connection with to make some accessible media for better serving individuals with disabilities in the health field. Further to that, I hope that I can also dive into accessibility within video gaming, also perspectives from people working on a fantastic project with Google to better understand individuals with their AI technology, individuals with Down syndrome, and a few other surprises along the way. So I want to thank you for joining me on our first episode